Thank you very much for this amazing movie. I think that everybody could feel the spirit of Perestroika after this. My suggestion is that I will start this conversation. I will ask you a couple of questions, and then everybody will have this possibility to ask more questions. And first of all, I would like to ask you to tell about how you did this movie. How was it? How was your trip organized? How did you explain to the embassy what you were going to do? And was kind of KGB or somebody control you when you wanted to do this? And in the movie we can see that these miners, they were very friendly. They were ready to give the interview, but was it from the very beginning? So were they friendly from the beginning?
First of all, thank you all for coming out to see this. I'm delighted to be here. I had made a film for public television of my first book and had spent some time working with documentary filmmakers in New York City. So I had had some experience in thinking about the ways in which the past could be presented to public audiences through film and television. My own background had been, before I became an historian, in English literature, and in particular in the theater. So I felt reasonably comfortable moving in this direction, perhaps naively so. I also worked at New York University that had a very distinguished film school, and my efforts to do this kind of work were encouraged by many of the filmmakers there, who went out of their way to demystify filmmaking as something that required enormous expertise. I should make one other thing, however, quite clear. Film work is collaborative. I'm happy to take questions and to take some credit for this film, but I had a very close working partner, Barbara Abrash, with whom I collaborated. She was not in Donetsk with me, but she was back in New York. And she was a full partner in the development of this project. And the film work itself required the collaboration with the translators and a crew, some of whom had very little background and some of whom had wonderful expertise that I had to draw upon. I had been asked by a young man from Pittsburgh if I could help him raise some money so that he could go to Donetsk to interview old-timers, much like the people in Pittsburgh, which was a new sister city with Donetsk. Glasnost, Perestroika had created new openings and opportunities, and the mayor of Donetsk thought this was an opportunity to develop economic relationships with Pittsburgh, and hoped that in going there he would find new development projects that the two cities could share. He went there and saw some interviews with Pittsburgh miners and steelworkers. This young, now unemployed steelworker was doing. His name was Larry Evans. And his wife was anxious to get him out of the house. She wanted him to do this work. And when the mayor of Donetsk saw it, he said, you know, we have old-timers who are miners and steelworkers in Donetsk. You should come here and interview them. And he said, great. Unfortunately, he had no background in making films, and he had no expertise that was going to win the hearts and minds, but most especially the pocketbooks of financiers. So he was given my name and asked if I wanted to come, and I said, sure. And ultimately, I directed the project. We raised our own money to go. And in total, for the month that we were there, I had 13 people with me, and the entire experience cost, in US dollars then, $2,600. Very little money. For this, we had rooms in the best hotel in Donetsk. It didn't have hot water, but it did have good cold water. And we had 3 meals, morning, noon, and night, with as much vodka, champagne, and cognac as we could drink. We had car service to take us around the city, and I had a translator who could live in my eardrum for those 3 weeks. Because I was the director, I also had a massage monsieur waiting for me at 6 o'clock every day. Olga, she was, it was, I think, torture more than monsieur, but it was a wonderful experience. So we were extremely well treated. It was the first time that cities like Donetsk, which had been closed to the west, had been opened up, and the mine made that possible. So we were among the first Westerners to appear in Donetsk. We had complete freedom to do whatever we wanted. The mayor had been on our side. The tourist agency that was helping us was run by an assistant to the mayor. The only trouble we ever had was when some of the young men who had been brought along on the ride, students at a university who were colleagues of Larry, this man from Pittsburgh, they rather innocently went around the city taking pictures of the railroad tracks. And I had to go get them out of jail because the police thought they must be spies of some sort because it was such a foreign experience. They were quickly let off and there was no other trouble whatsoever for all the time that we were there. I need to speak. I'm a New Yorker. We speak quickly. We try to speak more slowly for the translator in the back. I will tell you that at the end of the trip, I offered to give them the $2,600. And they said, oh, but we can't quite get a bank account to do this yet. So he asked me to go with him to the Berestyky store, and I'd pay for the trip not with $2,600, but with television sets and VCRs from the Berestyky store. So this entire trip was paid for in television sets and VCRs that they could use on the black market and barter and exchange in Donetsk.
Okay, thank you very much. If I may ask you one more question, and when we will ask maybe somebody else has questions. I was thinking about this identity question. That there is extensive discussion now about the identity in the Donbas, identity of the Donbas people. And could you see any transformation of identities in the late 80s in the Donbas, such as from class towards national identity, or did they still remain within this Soviet frames or Leninist frames? Because in your book you call this territory like New Ukraine, but they didn't mention Ukraine not at all in your movie. So could you feel this maybe in private conversations?
Certainly, our sense was that these people saw themselves as living in the Ukraine. We used the term New Ukraine with new as not as a capital letter. It was just meant to reflect the Ukraine after 89 and 90, rather than as an opportunity to think of a new society that was there. I will say that, of course, everyone spoke Russian. No one spoke Ukrainian of the people we were interviewing. Russian was the native language. And most of them explained that they had relatives and friends in Russia, but they thought of themselves as Russian Ukrainians, the way I would think of myself perhaps as a, Jewish American, or someone would be an Irish American or an Italian American. Their heritage and their background was Russian, but I always had the sense that they saw themselves very much as Ukrainian. When we went back in 92, I went to the museum, the local museum of the city of Donetsk, and in most cities that I've studied, when I study history and heritage, when there is a regime change, the history, the way in which the story is told in the museum changes. History is traditionally a story of told by winners. So when there were new winners, we thought the story would change. But the story was the same. The only thing that changed is all the titles were now in Ukrainian. And I went to see the curator then, and she said, well, history doesn't change, but they were changing the language. So there were just small efforts at that point. I would be curious years later to go back and see what would have changed. As for the references to Lenin, Stalin, these were people who saw themselves still as part of the Soviet Union in '89. They're breaking with it. But I think if there was any message that I came away with, and I hope the film gives a sense of it, is that these people don't speak with one voice. There were many different perspectives. The old-timers, they were the ones for whom the experience of Stalin coming out of the war had real meaning. And if there were people who were critical of Stalin, they often felt it was because Stalin had somehow subverted something in Lenin, Lenin's story. One reason I use the archival footage here is because it is both meant to be a document of the past, but it is also Soviet propaganda. But recognize, these are the stories that they grew up hearing all the time too. And it's only in 89, in 90, and 91 that they're beginning to step back. So I will tell you that when I brought the film to show them in Donetsk to the miners, and it was on Ukrainian television, I think in 1990 for the first time, when I showed it to the miners, they saw all this footage and they saw the archival footage and they just laughed. They already understood when the archival footage says, "We have the most modern mines," they knew this was a lie. The condition of the mines, and I went down later to see them, resembled mine conditions that had been outlawed in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century. They were horrific. These were hardly modern mines. And as you were told there, they spent 2 hours just going to the face of the mine and back. 1/4 of every working day is spent just getting to the face of the mine. So, you know, the real issue, I think, now for me looking back at this is seeing Gennady Kush at the end of the film saying that he remembers sitting there now in the square, and what matters to him is thinking that I'm making this fight not just for myself because I'm now an old man. He's actually quite young, but he's, for a miner, by the time you're in your 40s, you're an old man. He says, but I'm doing this for my son, so that he won't have these conditions in the mine. The truth is, most of these mines have a short future. The conditions are dreadful. The quality of the coal is very high sulfur content, not very good. Most of the seams have been exhausted. The future for the Ukraine and for the Donbas, of course, is to find new industry and new jobs for these people. And I think if there's anything poignant for me out of this history for this part of the Ukraine, it's perhaps to appreciate the long history of these people and what they accomplished. I'm reminded that, you know, in the winter when you get cold and you turn on your stove and your oven, it's Donetsk coal that's keeping you warm. And that coal will no longer, they did a lot of work in building Ukraine's industrial past. In the future, they're not going to be able to do that, and it's going to require all of Ukraine thinking about a future that probably will require thinking about new kinds of work for these people. Mining is not is maybe the immediate future because people have to live, they have to eat, but it can't be the long-term future for the Donbas.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I am inviting our guests to ask a question. Please just raise your hand. No, microphone.
Marta, student z Krukwa, Uniwersytet w Poznaniu. Jeśli wy nie...
From the Poznan University. I'll speak Russian if you don't mind. Right, so I have two questions. First of all, I know your book well. I'm familiar with your book, and it's a great book, much like the movie, much like the film, so I'm very grateful for your work. But I wanted to ask the following. If, in your memory, when did the question of independence first arise? Because what we saw today, we saw only economic questions, bread and butter questions. So, you know, they don't want the quotas to increase, they want soap to be available, etc., etc. But I'm interested, when did this question of independence first surface? So when did they start talking about, well, it would be better for us, or not better for us, if Ukraine were an independent state, if the Soviet Union were to collapse? This is the first question. The second question is, I wanted to ask, do you know what happened to these people. I mean, Gennady Kush or Valery Samokhvalov. Were you perhaps in touch with them later? And I'm just interested, what is their vision of this independent Ukrainian state? What they had to say about that? Did you have anything? Did you have any kind of connection with them? Thank you.
Great questions, for which you are really the expert, not me. She's the one who's been writing about identity in the Donbas in the period following this film. I was struck in thinking back how much that was not a question. And I think it's partially because I was there 89-90. And if you think about most of the breakup of the former Soviet Union, it takes place really the next year, 91. I was back in 92, and it was a fait accompli. But I think there is a kind of political contagion that as it begins to break up into all the other countries, you know, it's as much happening not in the Donbas but in all Ukraine, that independence. Probably as much about Kiev as it is about the Donbas. So I'd love to hear your answer to the question, actually.
Yes, next question, please. Volodymyr?
We know that in 1989, brave miners in the Donbas changed a lot in our country. They set a good example, and in 1991, most of them voted for Ukraine's independence. It was one of the largest percentages on the territory of Ukraine. So basically, these people felt the power, their own power to change, and I think that that's why they voted for Ukraine's independence. So why? During less than 20 years, well, it's sad for me to use the pronoun they, but they stooped down in their civil consciousness, or at least this is our vision of their civil stance.
If I understand your question, I'm not comfortable thinking about consciousness going up or going down so much, but rather just what is its nature and why. I think that the vote data that you've indicated reflects there's considerable alienation from the way in which they understood, and they talk about it in the film, Moscow taking profits from them. I think we began to hear later in the conversation their anxiety that Kiev was just going to replace Moscow in taking those profits. And you can answer better than I the extent to which that may be part of their continuing alienation today. I should add that about the question was asked earlier about what happens to some of these people. One example is Gennady Kush became a union bureaucrat himself toward the end, and there was some alienation from him as having privileged housing by 92. Valery Samokhvalov, he left the union movement and was feeling bitter because he wanted the union to give him money so he could start his own cafe, you know, and become an entrepreneur on his own. And so he was bitter that the union wasn't going to give him money for that. So there were a lot of new currents, you know, that were taking place. I think part of the challenge that we forget is that this was often a political transformation, but it doesn't always mean that people change their attitudes and their mentality. And that's part of the challenge, I think, probably for Ukraine and for the Donbas, is to have the kind of new thinking that can make possible a new society that mirrors the economic transformation, that was political transformation rather, of that moment in '89. And, revolutions, transformations, coup d'etats, struggles can be political, but Sometimes they also have to mean creating not the old Soviet man, but maybe they need some now new kind of Ukrainian person.
Any other questions? I would like to make one comment, and I would like to agree with Mr. Professor about the fact that institutional or state liberation or independence does not liberate or does not free our consciousness. That's why we have the current situation, but I will have a bit different question. Did you compare what happened in 1989, 1990 with the miners' strikes of 1998 that later led to some political movements and some rebellions in Ukraine, like Ukraine without Kuchma? So did you compare those two strikes?
No, people need to understand I'm an American historian. That is my real specialty. I'm now writing about Jewish heritage tourism. I write about heritage, memory, but I write as an Americanist, therefore looking at the ways in which American tourists come to these places. I've not been back to the Donbas. I have great regrets. I'm not ready to go this week. Thank you. I think there's a wonderful film to be made that goes back to see what happened to these men and to their children and the opportunities. It would be a wonderful sequel. I should live so long.
Okay, thank you very much. More questions, please?
I'm going to ask an unfair question also. When you were in the Donbas, I was in Poland watching Solidarity. And I wonder if you can speculate why things turned out so differently in the Polish Revolution compared to what you watched happening in Donbas. I know that your theme was more about like the economic and trade union orientation of it. Is that part of why Poland turned out so differently? Is that it really didn't take on, an issue of soap? It took on an issue of freedom. And I'm just asking if you could see that.
It is a hard question. I'm not quite sure how I would evaluate how Poland turned out. I was also in Solidarność, but I was there in '82. And to give you a sense of the complexity, I was asked to do some translating for Solidarność in Krakow. And they wanted me to understand in their platform how they were fighting for Polish identity, which they described as Catholic identity. And I said to them, I'm not sure that's the answer or the problem, and reminded them that a quarter of the people who lived in the western part of Poland were Protestants, and that a third of the population, if not half, had at one time been Jewish. So it's hard to think about that identity simply as Catholic, and that may be a problem of Polish freedom, for whatever it is. I'm not sure how I would understand, how in fact to account for the difference in all of these countries. In fact, if you look, for instance, at Hungary, the Hungarian government presently more resembles the Ukrainian government than it does the Polish government. And things change quickly. Poland's just had a new election of a new conservative government, and so I don't think things will go backwards in Poland quite like, to be honest, the way they have in Hungary. So it's just hard for me to... We know that things are often quite contingent, very different in each place. The configuration, the intellectual resources. I think it helped that in Poland they were able to get rid of a central government and create a new government. In Ukraine, it was in some ways like the American War for Independence. They overthrew the king. It was anti-colonial, but they didn't really replace the people who were here. And so they may have had the same old bureaucracy, bureaucrats, and set of attitudes entrenched in Ukraine, and that had not changed so much. Whereas at least in Poland there was an effort to create a new kind of central government. But this would just be my ill-formed guess.
Thank you very much. We still have time for several questions. Donbas.
If I may, I would like to ask about the movie. How many people did you interview, and why did you decide to build up your narration up in basically 2 or 3 phases? And and in what respect did you take into consideration your target audience? So if you could tell something about the main ideas behind organizing the movie exactly this way.
We interviewed about 40 or 50 people. Some were rather extensive interviews. Some were what we would describe as man-on-the-street interviews, where you go to a park and you interview children and other people. Some were interviews not with workers, but about addicts. So we interviewed doctors and professors and teachers about what was going on in the city and elsewhere. And the book allows us to talk to represent some of those kinds of things. You know, when you give a lecture, when you make a film, when you write an article for the newspaper, you have to make decisions about what can be in the story and what can't be. And you bear responsibility for that. But you have to create a narrative, and it has to hold people's attention. And sometimes we're very limited by what we have, and that seems to work. So you can interview someone who says incredibly interesting, profound things, but they're picking their nose when they do it. So you can't use it. Or, you know, they're looking out the window. So sometimes it's simply dependent on the footage you have. We collected the footage from Donetsk television of the people on the street, the beginning of the strike. And only when I got back to New York did I see that Valery Samofolov was on the square. That was not shot ahead, it was pure coincidence. Came backwards. So sometimes it's about what you have. The music, I did around the music track. I went to Little Odessa. And any of you know Little Odessa? It's Coney Island in Brooklyn. Okay? It's where the immigrant community of Russians has settled and Ukrainians have settled. So that's where I could get the music. And I used all the music really as historical elements. They're meant to signify different kinds of modern or older sets of ideas. So it's quite deliberate, for instance, that the soundtrack, I keep the old music on it, which is this grand triumphalist music, because you get a sense of the propagandistic character of that archival footage. But when I go around Donetsk, I use the modern, what I would call Euro-trash music, basically. Yeah. We had the interviews with these 2 men, and we chose them in part because they were made possible. I promise you there was much other material that they gave us that we couldn't use, so you have to then pick and choose what seems to work and what seems representative. Not everything they did would be all of that, but we felt there were enough differences. Ivan is not a member of the party. Gennady is a member of the party, and they talk about those things. One lives in this little cottage, one lives in this high-rise functional housing. That was a nice contrast. But we also felt it important then to add, for instance, the interviews in the beginning of the film, in which we had 5 or 6 people giving a sense of the different points of view, the different perspectives that we had. And I will tell you, this version doesn't tell you who they are. 2 of those people are heroes of socialist labor. The woman who wears all her badges, and we asked them to dress any way they wanted. That's how she chose to represent herself, with all of those badges in her front. And she is a hero of socialist labor. And the steel worker at the end, who is a steel worker, is also who supports the strike, is a hero of socialist labor. So using those 5 or 6 interviews there, and then all the commentary from the meeting, we felt gave us an opportunity at least to give a sense of the different perspectives. All of this footage is still in Pittsburgh, and people could make many different films out of it. You are all invited to do so.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 more questions, right?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to ask a question. Since I have roots in Donetsk, I would like to ask a question perhaps that on the first approach doesn't seem to have much to do with the topic, but is somewhat has to do with your question. I wanted to ask about that kind of civil identity or civil activism in the late 1930s when Ukrainianization ended. 43% of the employees of the industrial sphere worked. You spoke Ukrainian, and a lot fewer spoke in the 90s. So how could you confirm or disconfirm this data, or also? And the second question is: there was in the late 1980s. I know that there was a Ukrainian middle school in Slavyanogorsk. And it was under UNESCO's protectorate. What is its fate? Do you know what happened to it? Thank you very much.
No, I'm not competent because I'm historian from 19th century.
Clearly, I don't know either. I do believe, however, the data on the increasing use of Russian from before the war to the 80s and 90s is accurate. That there was much greater use of Ukrainian earlier. Increasingly, as the labor force expanded, it came from the attraction of people from Russia into Ukraine. That's my understanding of it.
Okay, and one more question.
Thank you. I was in the Donbas around the same time when you were there. Maybe a year later, and I was there at a meeting of the Ruch, the movement for Perestroika, the Ukrainian movement for Perestroika, and you showed those moods in the Donetsk, and they're exactly the same. They were exactly the same in the Luhansk region where I was, and the leaders were, the same kind of activist mindset. That atmosphere, you really hit that on the head. You really nailed that atmosphere in your film. But I have the question: as I represented Lviv, and the miners were really, really outraged that we removed the Lenin monument in Lviv. And I told them, we are building a democratic society. In Lviv, Lenin is not loved. We remove his monument. You like him, fine, you keep your monument. But I had the impression that they didn't like him too well either. So in your film, it feels like the name of Lenin was mentioned. So what was your sense? What was your impression? Were they entirely sincere in discussing Lenin? Because I couldn't understand I couldn't glean their approach, their attitude. Is my question clear?
Let me say that I believe this was at first a transitional moment where they still have, some of them still have a foot in the past. I think that transitional moment is fleeting. I would not be surprised if there was less enthusiasm to quote Lenin even 2 or 3 years later than there would have been. But I also should make clear, not everyone was quoting Lenin. You know, that happened. Maybe it's overrepresented here. There basically were 1 or 2 or 3 people. We were just struck, I remember, to hear those kinds of voices at the same time. I mean, you were hearing a whole range of voices, and that was part of their challenge, you know, at the time. Also recognize that, like in this meeting, not everyone speaks. So you only know the voices from those who are outspoken, and sometimes it's people with those strong convictions who are the ones who grab the microphone. So maybe we disproportionately hear some of those voices.
Thank you very much. І я думаю, мабуть, останнє питання, да, пан з останнього ряду.
Thank you for the work that you've done and your team has done. The question is, I don't really have a question about the call. I just wanted to present you these books that were written on the events of 1989-1991 by the members of the trade union, the independent trade union that was being formed, that was forming the independent trade union movement. And these were written dedicated to the 20th anniversary. I would like to give one for you and one for the museum or the library, for the center. We will give one to the library. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Walkowitz, for your answers for the film. I would like to remind you that we had with us today the director and producer of the film Perestroika from Below that was filmed in 1989. This film is available on YouTube. It's without Ukrainian subtitles, but I think that the film that you saw with subtitles will soon be available at the website for the Center for Urban History. Again, you are reminded that Professor Walkowitz's book is available at the Center's library, and you're very welcome to make use of it. Again, DonKult continues. We have events tomorrow and on Sunday. There's a lot going on. You're also, please take a look at the program on the website. Thank you all, and goodbye.